Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, July 17th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the ACC. There was some more news around Florida State and Clemson, and it might just be the Big 12 pushing more and more in that direction, and how I think it's going to start a little bit of a landslide here in the ACC that will happen fairly quickly, if I had to imagine. But then we'll get into UGA. I tend to believe this might just be Kirby Smart's best team he's had at UGA, and I'll break down why I think that and why I think this team's just a little bit different than the ones that he's had in past years. Then we'll get into a conversation that has gone around pretty much ad nauseum at this point. Horns Down was asked about rules in the SEC. They were asked, is Horns Down going to be a penalty going forward? And obviously it will not be, depending on the case, but we'll break down why that conversation to me has just become outright nauseating, if I'm being totally honest. And then we'll get into hinge players in each conference. We're going to start in the SEC today, and we'll make our way around throughout the next couple of weeks. Then we'll get into Wednesday what-ifs, and we'll do kind of a rivalry edition this time around, break down some of the biggest what-ifs and some of the big rivalries around the country, a ton that could happen this year, and flip those on their head, that's for sure. But then, before we jump in, I apologize for that. We got tons of graphics today, so we will get there, I promise. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and that's always good for everyone. So definitely use that, gsmcpodcast.net, if you need. So let's jump in. Oh, I apologize. Oh, we messed this up a little bit. I am very, very sorry about this. Let's see what we got here. Okay, we will work with this for today. I very much apologize. But the ACC is where I want to start, not the atmospheres. But the ACC is kind of staring down a very, very tough time in their future of the as a conference. There's definitely a lot of things up in the air for them as they move into kind of this new era of what they're under. But let's check out and make sure that this is what I want. Yes, it is. So the ACC is under a ton of pressure going into this next little bit, and Greg Sankey spoke on this in the SEC Media Days. He said he was focused on his 16 teams. They're not too much worried about adding anyone else at this very moment. They're kind of just focused on moving forward as their two. Paul Feinbaum added to that, saying if they were going to add anyone, it would be a North Carolina. It would be that type of team, maybe a Duke as well. So Florida State and Clemson, not necessarily towards the top of the list when you talk about the ACC. And I think for the past 9 months, it's kind of felt like it's been a ton of different entities kind of attacking the ACC from a ton of different directions. There's been so much going into these battles that they've been kind of fighting back and forth. And I think one of the big things that I've kind of noticed is it feels like everyone's just waiting for that first thing to happen. They're waiting for that first domino to fall. They're waiting for that first, bite to be taken out of the ACC, and then it'll be a free-for-all. So Florida State and Clemson are obviously going to be that first domino that falls, and I think one of the biggest things is, to my knowledge, at least from where I'm standing, they have about 3 options going forward, and it's go to the Big 12, which I think is likely the number one option at this very moment for both those schools, just because I think them going back to the ACC would be a little bit tough with the energy that has been created between the two, and also I think they feel that that's probably the best way for them to go forward. So I think that's option number 1. I think option number 2 is go back to the ACC, and that would be a very, very awkward conversation. That would be something that would be really, really interesting to watch for a number of different reasons. But at the end of the day, it would be very, very weird and definitely something that I don't necessarily expect to happen, but the reality is, if the Big 12 does not have that revenue to bring those schools in and make it worth their while, maybe that's an option for them. And then finally, the other option is really go independent or just beg the SEC to let you in. And that's not going to happen. I'll be totally honest with you. So really, there's 2 options, but this one is always out there if they want to take it. Obviously, this would kind of torpedo them in a lot of different ways and discussions going forward with college football. But at the end of the day, I do think it would be very, very interesting to watch that kind of unfold, because there would be a lot of questions. And I think the biggest thing here that everyone, has talked about them possibly going to the Big 12 and what that would mean, and, why would they go to the Big 12 and all of those different things. And the biggest thing for me is the Big 12 has something the ACC doesn't, and that's Brett Yormark. Their commissioner is, frankly, one of the most aggressive guys in the sport at this very moment. Other than the guys that strap it up on Saturdays, he is the one that is out for blood the most. The dude is going absolutely crazy on the conference realignment front and doing the absolute world to make sure that they are set up to be a top conference going forward. That's what he said at Big 12 Media Days. He said he wants to be the number one conference in the country. I said earlier that's going to take quite some time to pull off, but at the end of the day, it'll be really, really interesting to watch all of that unfold, because this is a very, very powerful guy, someone that can do a lot of really, really incredible things, and someone that'll be just fascinating to watch kind of unfold over the next little bit. And he's going to be aggressive in a lot of different ways, and the biggest way is going to be private equity. This guy is a businessman. He understands what the bottom line is, and in a lot of ways, especially in college sports right now, it's revenue. How much revenue do you have? How much are you kind of putting into that pot? And that's the biggest question for the ACC moving forward. The Big 12 as well, but they're being a little bit more proactive in selling some of their rights, getting some of those sponsorship deals, getting some of the things that, the ACC has not quite been as aggressive, at least outwardly as aggressive in terms of getting. So I think that's the biggest difference is Florida State and Clemson could stay where they're at. They could absolutely stay pat and be more than fine with where they're at. But at the end of the day, you need a little bit more money going forward. That's just the reality of this sport. The people that are, running the sport, that are doing incredible things, they tend to have the most money. That's just the reality. And if Florida State and Clemson are going to make the jump to another, second tier conference like the Big 12, they're going to end up needing more money. They're going to end up needing a little bit of help getting out of that conference and doing some of the things that are going to be a little bit tough for the ACC to counter, or for the SEC and the Big Ten to really care to do, because that's one of the other big things about the future of the sport is we're really playing about 3 or 4 different sports all at the same time. And they're split in terms of tiers of how much money do you have. And you get to make different decisions based on how much money you have. So the SEC and the Big Ten are sitting there, frankly, they don't have to move a muscle. They don't have to do much of anything if they don't want to, because the reality is they can, play around with this thing. They can do so many different things and not necessarily have to worry about the financial ramifications, because money's coming in, and it's coming in very, very quickly. So I do think that's part of this, where the SEC and the Big Ten might not be the aggressors right now because they don't need to be. They can sit back and just kind of watch all this happen, watch this unfold, and then when the first person takes a bite out of the ACC, which seems to be Brett Yormark in the Big 12, they're ready to jump in. I fully believe that that's kind of the case, and I think it's going to be somewhat of a free-for-all. Florida State and Clemson obviously are not, I've said this before, they're not the biggest things in the ACC in terms of college football. They are, but in terms of, a number of different things that go into a conference realignment, they're not towards the top. That's just the reality of this situation. But UNC, Duke, those are the teams that SEC is going to come after, and I think they're just waiting for the ACC to get a little bit wounded. I've kind of used this metaphor before talking about the ACC, but it feels like a bunch of hyenas just attacking one lion, although the ACC is not much of a lion right now, but just bear with me here. I do think it's one of those things where they're just waiting for the most confident, the most desperate hyena to take that first bite. Once that happens, then I think everyone else is piling on. And I think that comes in the form of maybe Miami finding their way up to the Big Ten because they're an AAU school, which seems to be a very, very strict moniker for the Big Ten going forward. Maybe SMU finds their way to the Big 12, even though that was a bit of a weird situation last time around. Georgia Tech could make their way back to the SEC or up to the Big Ten because they are another AAU school. So there's a ton of different variables here, but the reality is something's going to happen around that team and likely Clemson. I tend to believe they're going to move in tandem here, but something's going to happen around these teams very, very quickly. Whether that's, they're not going to play in the ACC in 2025 or they're not going to play going forward. I don't know what that entirely looks like, if I'm being totally honest, but I do think it's going to be very interesting to watch. I do think it's going to be something that is going to happen fairly quickly, and once that first bite is taken out, once Florida State and Clemson have found their new home, likely the Big 12, but we'll see what happens. Maybe they find their way back to the ACC and none of this is a problem, but I do think if they find their way to the Big 12, it is the start of just eating the ACC alive. I think the Big 10 and the SEC know that they don't have to put in a ton of money to help a lot of these teams get out of the conference, and if they were to put up the money for Florida State and Clemson and, give up a ton of their revenue to do that, then they wouldn't have the ability to go out and get North Carolina, go out and get Duke. So I think that would be kind of the path that I'm seeing happen here is Florida State and Clemson find their way to the Big 12. They're there for a couple of years. Maybe they're making, a little bit less, but more money than they were making in the ACC, but still less than the big dogs. And the SEC can bring in UNC, and the Big 10 can bring in Miami or whoever they want. And then in about 3 years, they can look back and say, okay, now we'll take Florida State and Clemson because we have bigger revenue, we have more money to throw around, and the Big 12 will be in a position where you're still going to be below these guys. So you're still going to be punching up, and it's still going to be really, really hard to figure that out. So we had a Power 5 about a year ago at this point. It's about to be a Power 3, and it's going to happen fairly quickly here, I think. So it's very kind of upsetting more than anything else. I'm firmly a believer in the regionality of the sport, but that's gone. And we kind of have to just kind of move on from that, if I'm being totally honest, and just kind of let these things happen. It'll be really, really interesting to watch this unfold. But at the end of the day, I do think Florida State and Clemson will be out of the ACC here pretty soon. And then I think it's somewhat of a free-for-all. So we'll definitely break that down as it happens. But we'll take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Kirby Smart and how I think this might just be the best UGA team he has ever had. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.